We did it. Did it, class. We have made it here officially for our last video lecture for English 370 on May 11th. Disregard everything on this slide except for the title. This is not the date. This is not the class. I neglected to update this slide. Forget about it. Today is our last class that we're going to be doing a video recorded lecture for. This will come on Wednesday, May 13th. I'm recording this a couple days early. Look at me ahead of the game. And then on Thursday, May the 14th, we're going to have our last synchronous class on Teams. And in that class, we're going to do some review mainly for your exam. So I'm happy to take any questions you have about things we didn't cover or things we covered briefly, but mostly that class is going to be very review oriented. That means this is our last content day. As requested, on Monday, we talked about linguistic relativity and this idea that the language you speak affects the way that you think. We didn't get to dive into it as much as we wanted to, and I thought I would come back to it and wrap that up, but no, I'm not going to do that. You can kind of pursue that a little bit more on your own. I've posted those slides on Moodle. There's some videos for you to watch. There's some interesting content that I didn't have time to get to. If you want to know more about it, go check that out there. Otherwise, we're going to keep going today because two classes voted. One class voted for linguistic relativity, and the other one voted for psycholinguistics. So that's today's class. I'm going to stop wasting time. We're going to dive right into it here and see what's up in the realm, the world and the realm combined of psycholinguistics. So in order to kick this off, we want to think about the types of data that we've been looking at in class up to this point. Particularly when we look at things like syntax and semantics. We talked about this at the beginning of our syntax module, actually. This idea that we were going to rely pretty heavily on introspection, right? Introspective behavior. And in that lecture, I contrasted introspective behavior with corpus data. And right, we talked about how corpus data can work somewhat nicer, perhaps, for things like phonetics or phonology, but less good for syntax where the units are bigger. And so we did more introspection. Excuse me. These were things like grammaticality judgments and truth value judgments. Why does this sentence sound weird, right? We saw things like, if I give you the sentence, I saw the, you can very easily intuit that this is an unacceptable sentence of English. And the syntax, with these intuitions, we didn't really know why this was weird. We just know that it's weird. It's part of this knowledge of what you know when you know a language. And in syntax, we delved a little bit into making rules, right? So we saw these selection rules, we saw these phrase structure rules that gave us a bit more clarity on why these things are bad. But we're still nonetheless very heavily relying on intuition. And one possible problem with that is that maybe our intuitions are telling us something else, right? We assume that the reason this is bad is because of something to do with grammaticality, but that's not the only possible explanation, as we'll see today. So instead, we're going to try and shift some of that burden from this introspective intuition data to something a little bit more experimental, a little bit more cognitive, perhaps. Often what this looks like in psycholinguistics is that we do tests, a series of tests. These often take place in a laboratory where they bring participants in and they test them on certain language data, but they don't test them for grammaticality judgments. Instead, they test them for things like processing speed or processing difficulty, which is often reflected in how quickly you can process something. Right? And this is this gives us, this processing speed works to give us a different entry point, a different access point to how people are doing language, how they're processing and thinking about language that we don't get from this more or less black and white, grammatical and ungrammatical. We can see like how long do people process certain types of linguistic components, chunks, sentences, phrases, sounds, whatever. We saw one methodology for doing this, possibly in day one, maybe day two, if day one we did more syllabus stuff. One of the very first classes we had this semester, we looked at one idea of this processing in real-time processing speed tests in self-paced reading experiments. We did this with garden path sentences. If you'll remember this, we did, let's see, garden path sentences are these kind of goofy sentences that start out one way and finish up another way in an unexpected way. And one test we have to see how people process garden path sentences is in this self-paced reading. What was it? Self-paced reading experiments? Yeah. And we're going to try another one of those now. This is a repeat of what we did in day two, but now we're viewing it from a slightly different angle. You ready? So you ready for a self-paced reading test? See how good your memory is of the first week of class. So what's going to happen is when I hit the next arrow, bung, a word is going to appear on the screen, and then I'm going to read it, process it, and hit the next arrow again, and the next word comes up, and the next word, and the next word, and the next word, until the sentence is through. These things typically have to do with just a single utterance or sentence. So you can't take this one independently. Your next button won't actually control the slides on a YouTube video. You'll be shocked to find out, but I've also posted these slides on the Moodle, and so if you want to do it yourself, you can do it there. As we're going to do it now, I'll be your proxy and I'll walk you through this. So here we go. Read these words one at a time as they come up on your screen. Talking seems to be difficult today, so bear with me if I'm a little stuttery. Let's do it. This is your begin symbol. All right. Do it one more time. Ready? So think, if you will, what's that sentence? Okay, so that sentence is the government plans to raise taxes failed. It's actually a really pretty normal sentence, and it's unambiguous in a lot of ways. This can only mean one thing, but the interesting part is that the beginning of the sentence, as we go through it word by word, kind of fools you into imagining one syntactic structure. And once you get to the end of the sentence, you realize that that is the incorrect structure. You've been building cognitively the wrong syntactic structure, and you need to reshape what you thought. So you go through it somewhat like this, right? You go through the government. That's a nice DP with this as our determiner, and this is our noun head, right? So we have a DP here, your brain reads, and then we get to plans, and we're like, okay, the government plans. This is a good verb, a present tense verb. The government plans to do something. Solid, solid. We get here, plans to, yeah, they plan to do something. What do they plan to do? They plan to raise. This is a fine complement there. What do they plan to raise? Taxes. The government plans to raise taxes. And we're like, sweet, I understand this. And then this word shows up. And you like blink back, you do a little like, reaction like that. And now you have to reanalyze what came before it, because this word doesn't make sense, right? The government plans to raise taxes. Failed, right? It's not like a commentary on the government's inability to carry out anything in today's age. It could be, but it's not in this case. Instead, kind of is, but just not the way that we thought it was. Instead, we have to reanalyze this sentence, right? So we go through it again. Now we have to reprocess in our minds the government. So now this is still our determiner, but now we realize that government plans here is not a verb. It's a noun. And government is describing the type of plans. Whose plans? The government plans. The government plans, that's our DP. The government plans to raise taxes. Now, this is also reanalyzed. Instead of being verbal, what the government's doing, this is a descriptor of which plans. Which government plans? The government plans to raise taxes. So our DP is actually this entire thing. The government plans to raise taxes. The government has a plan. Which plan? To raise taxes. What happened to it? What did it do? Well, it failed. So we have to do a total rewrite of the sentence that we've that we have once we get to this word failed. It really hinges on this word plans, right? Whether plans in the government plans to raise taxes is the core noun or whether it's the core verb. These are garden path sentences. And so what you'll see when people do these read-throughs of the sentence word by word, they truck, they're like, yeah. Oh, the government plans to raise taxes here. And once they get to here, you'll see a spike in their response time before they hit the next button. There's usually an end slide as well. I've neglected to put an end slide in. So you see a spike in processing time, a spike in lapsed time before they hit the next button, once you get to this word, which is a signal of something happening cognitively, which we can hypothesize is them reanalyzing the sentence in their brain to come up with the right sentence. Cool, right? That's a reaction speed test. Right? And this works, the garden path sentences are famous for this type of experience. So here's some other ones. The horse raced past the barn fell. I believe that's the one we did in class, the second day of class, first or second day of class. The cotton clothing is made of grows in Mississippi, and my favorite one, the old man, the boat. The old man, the boats. The old man, the boats, which seems at first just like a nice DP, the old man and the boats. And it seems like you're just missing a verb until you realize that man is the verb. The old, collectively, are manning the boats. They're like the ones that are doing the rowing. This is a strange society, cruel society in which the old are forced to row the boats, man the boats. So this is what we're talking about when we say that in psycholinguistics we're shifting where our data comes from. These aren't from, the data that we're looking at here has to do with processing speeds. It doesn't have to do with grammaticality judgments. There's nothing, everybody agrees that this type of sentence, the government plans to raise taxes failed, is nice and grammatical. What those intuitions don't tell us is that there's something weird with processing, with cognitive processing going on in these garden path sentences. And this methodology, this self-paced reading experiment, is a good way to get at that difficulty that speakers have in processing garden paths. The shift in data, that's what's important about this. And so we might have to update our descriptors of language, right? So we can talk about there being grammaticality versus ungrammaticality on a syntactic level. This was something like, the marker, that's a bad example. What did we have up here? The man ate the, the man ate the what? Like there's something missing there, right? These are syntactic structural issues of things missing. That's an ungrammatical sentence. There's also semantically weird sentences, right? These are things like colorless green ideas sleep furiously, a famous Chomskyan sentence. We already had these two flavors of unacceptability, ungrammaticality and semantic oddity. And so maybe we need to add a third type of unacceptability or a third type of descriptor, which is cognitive processing difficulties. So it's not that it's ungrammatical. It's not that it doesn't make semantic sense. It's that it's hard to process. A good example of this processing difficulty are these what are called center embedding sentences. Center embeddings are things like this. They're relative clauses that appear inside DPs. They're descriptors of the DP. So here we have a sentence, the cat ran off, and we can center embed this relative clause, Bill saw, to describe the type of cat. So it's the cat Bill saw ran off. A pretty good sentence, right? Hopefully you're at home like, yeah, the cat Bill saw. You can put in the silent that there, so the cat that Bill saw ran off, but you critically don't need the that. You can just say the cat Bill saw ran off. Which cat? The cat Bill saw. And so what's cool about these center embeddings is that when you get just one, like we have here, it's just pretty easy for us to cognitively process what's going on here. There's almost no difficulty. This check for grammatical, check for semantic, check for processing. But when you try and do this iteratively, to a double center embedding, right? You get something like this. So instead of the cat Bill saw, now we have the cat, the dog, the rat saw, Chase died. These are some of my favorite examples because we did the exact same syntactic structural move here. Is we took a DP in the cat and we described it with Bill saw. The cat Bill saw. And it was perfectly fine. So now we should be able to do the exact same thing to Bill. Which Bill? Which Bill? The Bill that I met on Tuesday. So we'd have like the cat Bill that I met on Tuesday saw ran off. As soon as you add that second descriptor, that second center embedding, these sentences get wild and your mind breaks. So we know syntactically that this is a process that we can do to DPs, to determiner phrases, like the cat. And we have a DP here, Bill. So we should be able to do the exact same process over again to Bill. Syntactically, this makes perfect sense. But when we actually do it, and we get something like the cat, the dog, the rat saw, Chase died, it just sounds like word salad, like truly horrifically bad. Right? This is you can make a strong argument that this is grammatically acceptable in English. Following our syntactic rules, our phrase structure rules, this is well-formed sentence of English. You can make that argument. I will make that argument. And you can also make the argument that this is semantically well-formed. It's hard to unravel what's happening here, right? So this is, which dog? Well, it's the dog the rat saw. The dog the rat saw. You start from the inside out. This is how you work the semantics of this. We're going to try and process this. And if my brain breaks in the process, you'll forgive me if I just end up in a puddle on the floor. Send help. It's Monday, so I'll have been there for 2 days by the time you watch this. But send help nonetheless. So which dog? The dog the rat saw. The dog, the rat saw the dog. Which cat? The cat the dog chased. The dog is doing the chasing. So again, you do this unfolding where the rat is doing the seeing and seeing the dog. The dog is doing the chasing and chasing the cat. And the cat is the one that's dying. The cat died. Which cat? The one the dog chased. Which dog? The one the rat saw. Whew. I did it and I didn't explode. So it's semantically well-formed. Kind of. So it's shoulder shrug grammatical, it's shoulder shrug semantic, but when it comes to cognitive processing, it's horrific. Truly, truly horrendous. I hope you share that. We can ask ourselves, like, okay, this is weird and I just set you up. Do we actually find this in actual language? And you kind of do, right? So here's, I think, an example that comes close. This is from the novel Two Trains Running about Al Capone. And here's the setting, right? Two men are talking about Al Capone, who's just been sent to Alcatraz, where they expect him to die of untreated syphilis. Right, and the first person asks, but couldn't a doctor? Oh, no, I'm in the way. Move my big head. Oh, I moved the thing instead, which I suppose would work, but no, I want to move me. Here, move me up here for now. I'm up here. Anyway, so the first person says, but couldn't a doctor? And the second person says, what, fix him? Maybe if he'd gotten to one in time, but soon as they were sure they had him infected, they boxed him up and shipped him to Alcatraz. That's when Big Al stopped running the show. No more special treatment, no privileges, no nothing. All right, you ready for it? Here it is. And the only thing the doctors they had in there ever treated was stab wounds. It's like it actually sounds not so bad, but this is a very similar process to the one we just saw. So I'll make the argument, as I move myself back into position, that we do actually find this kind of stuff in natural language, and it tends to sound better than when it's artificially done like this. Context helps a lot, and actually extra linguistic material can help a lot for our brains in processing. Another kind of interesting fact, when you pare it down to this, where it's just like deepy, 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 verb, 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 it makes it a lot more difficult to process who's doing what, when, where, why. All those WH words. So this is cool. This is cool. We're talking here about cognitive processing of language and cognitive difficulties. One more kind of interesting psycholinguistic thing that I'm just going to mention briefly to you, we're not going to dwell on this, is what's called the McGurk effect. And so we've talked at some, not as much as I would have liked, to be honest, about sign languages in this class, but we've at least hit on sign languages a little bit near the beginning of our semester, and the fact that they use a different modality. They use this audiovisual modality as the primary modality for the language communication. And we talked about spoken language as this verbal auditory channel. But there's some really cool psycholinguistic evidence that just because spoken language is primarily vocal auditory doesn't mean it's entirely vocal auditory. And there's pretty cool evidence that when we're observing and we're processing spoken language, we also include in our observations visual cues. And here we get the McGurk effect. So watch this video quickly. This is, there we go. Watch this video, pause me, and watch this one instead. And then come back to this video and unpause me. I'll wait here. Okay, I've waited here. Hopefully you went and watched that video. What you saw there was this cool effect where you're hearing the same audio signal. So you're always hearing ba, ba, or you're always hearing fa, fa, I forget, ba, 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 and you're hearing this ba, right? Ba, ba, ba. But when you change the visual signal, it actually changes how we process what we're hearing. So when you see somebody make that bilabial, we're imagining that the audio signal is held constant, ba, 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 ba. And when you pair that audio signal with a visual signal of somebody making a bilabial stop, ba, ba. You can see my lips very readily. You know that I'm making a bilabial stop, ba, ba, ba. You hear a B sound. But when that exact same audio sound is rendered with the visuals of somebody making a labiodental with the lower lip on the top teeth, fa, 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 you hear fa. And you hear fa even though the audio signal hasn't changed. You hear ba in one condition and fa in the other condition, even though if you closed your eyes, you wouldn't be able to tell which is which. This shows us something cool. This is called the McGurk effect, which is that we don't just rely on our ears. And you can tell that by closing your eyes. You literally hear things differently when you close your eyes. How wild is that, right? You hear things differently when you close your eyes. That's awesome. And it tells us an aspect of the psychological processing of language that we can't, again, we can't get this from like grammaticality judgments and truth conditions and stuff. We need different ways to get at this kind of, these effects of cognitive processing on language. Sweet. How am I doing? 25 minutes in, I'm doing all right. Cool. So this is kind of the first half of the lecture. And the take-home point of this half of the lecture is that one aspect of language study, linguistics, right, scientific study of language that we haven't gotten to at this class has to do with the processing of language. And to get at these processing effects, we need new methods. We can't rely on things like intuitions. So instead, we have to come up with these tests that test things like response time, perception differences given different conditions, etc. We have these different methodologies that get us at processing time and cognitive processing difficulties, like we saw in the center embedding case. Very cool. Very, very cool aspects of psycholinguistics. You're getting kind of a whirlwind tour of psycholinguistics right now. In the second half of the lecture, I want to switch gears slightly. We're still going to be talking about cognition and language processing, but I want to look at the brain, because there is many elements of linguistics that are cognitive science as their basis, right? They really are cognitive science. Linguistics runs this interesting gamut from being a social science to being in the humanities division to being a cognitive science to language is just such a primal feature of people and both who we are and our shared experience that linguistics touches on a lot of different fields. And cognitive science is one of them. So we're going to look at brains. Hooray for brains. They're cool. And we're going to look in particular at some different syndromes. And syndromes are these disorders that affect cognitive skills and brain function. And the question we want to ask is that, is overall intelligence related to language? Is there a central aspect such that, like, the smarter you are, the better you are at language? Or, the more we boost somebody's intelligence capacity, overall cognitive capacity, if you want to think about that, it's viable to be skeptical about whether general intelligence is even a real thing or not. But for the sake of argument right now, let's assume that it is, and ask ourselves the question, wonder to ourselves, if we boost somebody's overall intelligence, would we also boost their linguistic abilities? Right? The underlying question here that we want to ask is, right, is language ability its own thing, its own kind of module, its own section of the brain? Or is it tied into just general cognition? That's what we want to ask ourselves. So hopefully that question makes sense. Is linguistic ability tied to overall cognitive ability, or is it independent thereof? And we can use syndromes to actually, these disorders, these cognitive disorders, to give us some preliminary evidence on this question. So one place we can look, for instance, is between individuals that have different syndromes and how they respond both in overall general cognitive capacity and in linguistic ability. Two syndromes that are particularly interesting in this area are Williams syndrome and Down syndrome, which showcase a lot of similarities, right? Both of these syndromes have distinctive facial features, similar disease processes like cardiovascular, learning disabilities in some similar ways. They share a lot. They're not identical. They're not the same thing. They're different for very good reasons, but they do share a lot of symptoms. But where they differ is in linguistic ability. Their linguistic performances look wildly different, and I'll show you some. Before I show you some, I'm going to be giving you some examples of data from people with cognitive disorders, from syndromes, and I don't want them to be misconstrued by me. I'm showing you these things as a cognitive scientist now, so we want to be careful not to, laugh at people's misfortune or laugh at people's differential ability in cognitive processing. That's just never an okay thing for us to engage in. So we want to engage in this material as scientists and be careful not to be judgmental thereof, as a forewarning. So we can see that here are some differential linguistic performances by people that have either Williams syndrome or Down syndrome. If somebody, when asked the question, what if you were a bird, a person with Williams syndrome answers, you could fly, you could have babies, fly north or south, east or west. And a person with Down syndrome answers birdseed. Another response was good question. I'd fly through the air being free, again from Williams syndrome, and Down syndrome says you'd be strong. Right. Yet another example from Williams syndrome. I would fly where my parents could never find me. Birds want to be independent. And our last response from Down syndrome is I am not a bird, you have wing. So we see again drastically different performances in linguistic ability here, where Williams syndrome exhibits much higher degrees of linguistic complexity and relation as well. Right. A much higher degree of linguistic ability from Williams syndrome as Down syndrome, even though their overall cognitive capacity is somewhat similar. So what this shows us, what does this show us? I flashed the slide. Hopefully you didn't snag a read of it. What does this show us? What does this hint to us? I mean, none of this is conclusive, of course. We're making conjectures here, but conjecture with me for the moment, if you would. What does this show us about the idea of language either being tied into general cognitive ability or separate therefrom? Well, it suggests that perhaps language is independent, because when you have overall lower cognition in these people with particular syndromes, it's not necessarily the case that you have lower linguistic performance. One varies without the other one. Really interesting. Really interesting implications for language and linguistic cognition in the brain. Hopefully that makes sense. So the other area that we can look to for some evidence about the independence of an independent language module is disorders that kind of do the opposite. They selectively impair linguistic ability while leaving cognitive ability intact, right? So in this scenario, we saw overall cognitive ability a decrease, but not necessarily the overall linguistic performance decreasing. So now we want to see if we can get the other one to happen. We don't want the other one to happen. It's a terrible thing to say. We are looking for evidence in other syndromes or other cognitive disorders in which linguistic ability drops, leaving cognitive ability. And for this sort of thing, we look to accidents and enter everybody's favorite railroad worker, Phineas Gage, a very famous individual. If you've taken some psychology classes or something, you've probably heard of him there. Phineas Gage, here he is. He was a 25-year-old railroad worker. He was working on a railroad and he fell victim to an explosion, accidental explosion. And what happened was that a railroad spike, this very same railroad spike, I presume, was driven through his head. It went into his left cheek. You can see his left eye being closed there. Into his left cheek and out the top of his head, puncturing through in this explosion. And what's fascinating and famous about Gage is that he not only survived, which is bizarre in its own right. Most people would think that having a spike driven through your head is not a survivable occurrence, but it is. Not always. Don't try this at home, but it's possible to at least. So, and not only did he survive, he was kind of with it, and he sat up after the accident and told a doctor what happened. Explained to doctor the story of the explosion and what happened to him. He didn't experience all that much of physical or cognitive limitations from this. He was actually pretty much fine, surprisingly fine. His language and motor functions were fine, but he showed major personality changes. Interestingly, the after effects of this disaster, of course, he had to heal the literal holes in his head. But after that, the only long-term ramifications cognitively were major personality changes. People reported that he was kind of a different person. He behaved differently. He liked different things. Really, really fascinating. And so, right, what this led researchers at the time, remember again that we're back in time here, What this led researchers to investigate and sort of believe was that there are different regions of the brain which control different aspects of cognition and abilities. So this spike went through presumably an area of his brain that housed certain personality information. And so this led us to wonder back in the day, which we've now confirmed, is that there are different regions of the brain that are associated with different abilities. And this extends to linguistic abilities as well. In 1861, this is not too long after Phineas Gage, actually, this scientist, Paul Broca, was examining a patient who suffered from a brain condition and was unable to speak. And they were doing this through, after the patient had passed away, they examined the patient's brain via autopsy. And so this particular patient that Broca was looking at made him unable to speak. We'll investigate what that means a little bit later on. And what Broca found was that there was damage on the frontal lobe on the left side, so this area right here, which will later become known as Broca's area. This patient could understand language, he would follow commands, but he could not produce language. Again, we'll delve a little further into this. This led Broca to suggest that language production and language comprehension are in two different areas of the brain, and that this area, Broca's area, controls linguistic production, which is really interesting. It was a way to sort of find where language was housed in the brain. Here you can see a diagram with Broca's area right here, right where that damage was. Another scientist who did similar things, Carl Wernicke, studied a patient who suffered a stroke. And this patient exhibited different linguistic difficulties than Broca's patient. This patient could speak fluently, so they could produce language very fluently, but would not understand language, right? Like wouldn't follow commands truly, maybe a little bit, but not the amount of understanding that Broca's patient exhibited. And so it was seen that here was another linguistic area. Here's where the stroke in Wernicke's patient happened, which is again now become known as Wernicke's area. So we have Broca's and Wernicke's area. And roughly what people thought was, you know, maybe this is where linguistic production lives and this is where linguistic comprehension lives. And we'll delve into that and see that it's a little bit more complicated than that, and we'll do that by looking at speech from people who either have Broca's aphasia or Wernicke's aphasia. When one of these areas gets damaged and it affects your linguistic ability, that's a condition known as aphasia. And if the damage happens in Broca's area, then we call that Broca's aphasia. And when the damage happens in Wernicke's area, that's known as Wernicke's aphasia. This is most often because of stroke. It can be trauma as well, such as Phineas Gage, but that's less likely. The most common way to see damage in these areas is stroke. So I'll give you a couple examples, and I want to kind of see what you think, what you notice about these different speech patterns that the two types of aphasic patients demonstrate. So here is an example of speech from a patient with Broca's aphasia. Cinderella, scrubbing and a hard worker, stepmother, go but not. I'm not going to read it all. You can go ahead and read this for a bit. Scrubbing and what you call it and working. Stepmother, really ugly. Dress break. So this is obviously a Cinderella story. And I say that, and I mean that. This is very obviously a Cinderella story, right? Remember that this is spoken by somebody who has Broca's aphasia. So Broca's original assessment was that the patient couldn't speak. Well, that may have been a bit of a premature notion. This patient can clearly speak. But nonetheless, there is linguistic difficulty going on here. How so? How so? So we want to look at this from a few different dimensions. I'll give you a second. You can pause it as well to figure out sort of where is this patient having difficulties? Is this patient having difficulty remembering Cinderella's story? Does this rendition of Cinderella's story sort of follow the narrative? I would argue that it does. The patient remembers and is recalling Cinderella's story. Their trouble instead is with the actual production. To tell the story is difficult. That production, just like Broca said originally, it's the production that's really hard here. We see the person working through this and struggling through this. There's some things that are hard here for Broca's aphasia, including word recall. Word recall seems to be kind of tough. Stepmother go but not, right? They struggle a little bit with word recall, but even more so, they struggle with syntactic structures. We find that the syntax is off. They eventually get there on the words, but they don't get to fluent grammatical structures. So syntax has taken a hit here in Broca's aphasia. Really cool, right? Really cool. Syntactic troubles, some production troubles. If I was to summarize this, that's what I would say. Syntactic troubles and production troubles. Now look at an example of an aphasic, a Wernicke's aphasia patient speaking. This is themselves, the patient themselves reporting on their stroke in a hospital setting, and they say this: I just suddenly had a pfeffert, and all the pfeffert had gone with it. Event stopped my horn. They took them from earth, they make my favorite 9 to severed, and now I'm been habed by the starn of fortment and my annulment, which is now forever. What's going on here? Again, something's off. And again, we don't want to laugh at these things. We want to analyze these things. Okay, you can laugh maybe just a touch at the word pfeffert, because that's a fantastic word, but not at the patient themselves by any means. What's going on here? Where is this patient exhibiting linguistic difficulty, and how is it different from Broca's? That's kind of what's interesting about these things. Broca's patient, the Broca patient here, this isn't Broca's original patient or anything, but somebody with Broca's aphasia, in this passage was struggling with syntax, we said, with the structure. Is this patient struggling with syntax and fluent production? No, and it's hard to know this over text as well. It's more obvious yet when you hear these patients speaking, how effortful this was for the patient and how fluent this sounded. So it's not a syntactic issue. It's not fluency. It's something else. What else is it? Well, where this Broca's patient, the story was followable, if rough, because of the production. The bones of a Cinderella story were here. Here, I have no idea what's going on. It's nonsensical in some ways, right? The semantics is all over the place. Here, there's a semantic through line. Here, there's not. To the point where here, there's made up words, right? Like pfeffert and fortment and habed and starn, right? These are made up words. They sound actually, they follow phonotactic rules. If you remember from our phonology segment, they're actually pretty good English words phonotactically. They just don't exist. So there's this kind of semantic nonsense. So this patient, Broca's patients, struggle with production and they struggle with syntax. Here, these patients struggle with comprehension, not production. Again, remember Wernicke's original assessment. They struggle with comprehension. They don't respond to commands as well as Broca's aphasia patients. And also they struggle with semantics and word recall. There's a summary of those things we just said. So we find here multiple divides, one divide between comprehension and production between these two areas. And we also find this divide between syntax and semantics. And I find I don't know. Listen, I'm not a psycholinguist. This isn't my area of specialty. So also, if you've taken a ton of psychology classes or something like that, this may not be a perfect rendition of these things. But what I find most interesting here is a lot of things. I don't find any one thing most interesting, but one of the things I find quite interesting is this pairing of production and syntax and comprehension and semantics difficulties. Production and syntax difficulties going together, and semantics and comprehension difficulties going together. That has really fascinating implications, I think, for where these things are stored in our brains, right? Actual physical linguistic modules here and here, right? Really, really fascinating. And they do, there's some really cool research that has been done in these areas. They actually have impulse like electrical pulsing devices that you can wear a headset, and it will put different electrical pulses on your brain in different areas, and if you position them in the right areas, you can actually start to simulate some of these aphasia-like qualities in participants safely. You can look up some demonstrations of that. That's really interesting, where cognitively neurotypical adults, you can kind of like zap their brains in certain ways to see how these effects happen. Really, really, really weird, but really interesting nonetheless. And so we can probe at these. We don't know, there's a lot we have to learn about these kinds of things. There's a lot of stuff we don't know about the brain in general, although, huge progress has been made over the past 30 years, of course. Who knows where we'll be 30 years from now, but for now, there's a lot of stuff we don't know, but we're learning a lot, and there's some really interesting implications of everything that we learn with regards to language and linguistics and psycholinguistics and cognitive development and stuff like that. So here we have two aspects that I've squeaky chair, apologies. We have two elements of psycholinguistics that we've looked at today. One is that we've looked at the differences in cognitive processing and processing difficulty that we see in language, even for neurotypical adults, with things like double center embedding that break our brains a little bit, right? And we kind of introduced this new category of linguistic analysis on top of ungrammaticality and semantic oddity. We can have difficulty in processing oddity, if you want to think about it like that. That was one part, and we found some ways to test this. We did things like a self-paced reading test. We also looked at this like double center embedding and just the fact that we can't process it. Another one that we didn't look at is eye tracking. So you can see how people read to get at something about how they're processing. Different methods for telling how people are actually processing language. So that's one part of psycholinguistics we looked at. And then we shifted gears in the second half of this lecture and looked a bit more at how, where and how language exists in the brain cognitively. And we looked at this through things like syndromes, like Williams syndrome versus Down syndrome, and got at this question of, is linguistic ability independent from overall cognition? And we got some preliminary evidence that it may be. Or it may be in part. This doesn't mean necessarily that linguistic ability is entirely separate from general cognition and general cognitive function. It could just be in parts that it's different. But there does seem to be some evidence that there are localized regions of the brain which can be affected to negatively impact various aspects of your linguistic performance here. Particularly, we looked at these two aphasias, Broca's aphasia and Wernicke's aphasia, that gave us some interesting insights into where linguistic processing exists in our brains. So those are cool two aspects of psycholinguistics that we got a chance to look at today. There's a lot more going on here as well. Like we said, we can put these nets, on people's heads and see where their brains are lighting up. We don't just have to shock them and zap different parts of their brain. We can also see what parts of their brain are lighting up in different ways when they're performing different linguistic tasks. that's an issue that or not an issue, a topic that I haven't talked about today within psycholinguistics. There's also aspects of child language acquisition that kind of can fall under a psycholinguistic heading that we haven't looked at. There's a bunch of different methodologies that we could go into, priming and things like that. Ooh, kind of wish we had talked about priming. Ask me later, maybe. Priming's super fascinating, psycholinguistic, psychology in general, not linguistic-specific methodology or thing that we could talk about. Whoa, words are hard after talking straight for 50 minutes. And I am at my 50 minutes, so we're going to cut off here. This week I hope to have broadened our horizons a little bit, again, like we did with sociolinguistics and historical linguistics, where in the first 3/4 of this class, we really did a deep dive in getting all these linguistic tools with regards to phonetics and phonology and semantics, pragmatics, morphology, syntax, right? And now we find that there's a lot more out there, a lot more intersections of linguistics with other things, linguistics and cognitive science, linguistics and psychology, linguistics and anthropology, linguistics and history, linguistics and. There's a lot of linguistics ands. We didn't talk about computational linguistics, linguistics and data science or computer science. So there's really is a broad field, a lot to be learned, a lot to be excited about. So my goal here, as we sort of wrap up the contentful bit of linguistics in this English 370 linguistics class, is to imbue with you an excitement and a fascination for the field of linguistics. Is not to make you masters of linguistics, right? This was an introductory survey where we looked at a ton of different areas of linguistics, and we learned a lot about each, but there's more to be learned in each area. There's always more to be pushed. There's always boundaries to be pushed, always research questions that we can be getting at in linguistics. And it's that excitement, that drive, that interest that I hope to have imparted to you, because I certainly haven't. When I hear about these things that I really know very little about generally, like cognitive science and areas of the brain and these aphasias and where things are, Phineas Gage, I hope it gets your curiosity going, right? Because it's curiosity that drives these things. And curiosity will serve you well in whatever academic pursuit you choose to pursuit that you're pursuing here at the university or in life in general. It's not just for academics. So I hope to have fostered a little bit of that curiosity in the area of language, and whether you carry that forward with you in language or whether you take that curiosity and pick up your bags and go elsewhere, that's totally fine, but I hope you do hold on to some of this excitement that we've hoped to channel in this classroom and take that with you. Anyway, I'll stop ranting, I'll stop blabbing. We're not quite done yet. I'll see you on Thursday for a synchronous in-person chat to wrap up this semester. And don't be a stranger also moving forward. Feel free to email me. Reach out. We can chat if there's an area of linguistics you're like, oh man, I really would have liked you to talk about priming. Just like send me an email sometime and we can chat about it. I'm always happy to talk linguistics. I'm always around. So have a great one. I'm going to stop the recording and I'll see you all on Thursday. Thanks for tuning in.